even if you, the listener, you do have or you're thinking of having what's commonly called an interview-based podcast, start changing it in your own mind to a conversation-based podcast.
I think interrupting appropriately and respectfully is something that quite literally only comes with practice. But also the preparation of questions, the guiding of conversation, the chronology and flow of the conversation, the preparation you do or the lack thereof, but the space you create.
I hate podcasts that just ask the same 6 questions to 1,000 guests. Could we not have some different questions?
Does marketing and content creation ever feel hard and time-consuming? What if it didn't have to be that way?
Join Rob Drummond,
Matthew Bliss,
and me, Pete Daly-Dickson, your ideal companions on the journey to a value-first approach to business growth, here on Help Before You Sell.
So you're not wearing your delinquent's costume today then, Matt?
No, I have delinquented and removed my hood to reveal my unkempt lock, which is, of course, only visible on the video version of this episode, which if you are watching that, then I hope you enjoy. But we've also just come off a 2-hour-long conversation where I've been activated podcastly by our conversation partner expert, Rob Drummond.
The downside of which means that everyone's brains are now mush. So who knows what we're going to talk about in this episode.
I am grabbing at the longest straws that I can to keep the conversation moving.
If your brain's a mush and I can't string 2 sentences together without going into a coughing fit, then this is going to be a really interesting episode for people to listen to.
I've got a nice bridge into today's topic, though. So our brains are mush. You can't stop coughing, and I thought today we'd talk about the art of the interview, on the basis of the fact that you interviewed me yesterday, Pete, for Not a Straight Line, and I've just interviewed Matt for his Coffee with a Podcaster podcast. So I thought we'd take a break from going through different channels and different media today. Just talk about what makes a good interview, one of which is perhaps silencing yourself to cough and die quietly.
Yeah. I mean, for me, joking apart, one of the things that makes for a good interview, from my perspective anyway, is to not frame it as an interview.
The horrible word interview.
Yeah. And I deliberately, right from the very beginning, when I put the booking link together for guests to book onto the calendar, I deliberately didn't have podcast interview in the title. It was podcast conversation. And I will correct guests who email or talk about being interviewed and say, no, we're going to have a conversation, just to constantly reframe the expectation. Because for my money, nothing good comes from an interview. Well, occasionally you might get the job, but more often than not, you don't get what you want. You kind of feel like you're being interrogated. Whereas a conversation is natural.
It evokes an image of you sitting on the other side of the desk to someone in a suit who's like Mr. Big, and you need something from Mr. Big, and you're there with like your bowl of porridge saying, "Please, sir, please might I have some more?"
Yeah. It implies an exchange too, that podcasts just don't do that. Like, they're very intimate, they're conversational, they're collaborative. It's not host versus guest. That's what interview really implies.
Yeah. So right out of the gate, that's what I would say is reframe. Even if you, the listener, you do have or you're thinking of having and what's commonly called an interview-based podcast, start changing it in your own mind to a conversation-based podcast.
You've got to give a bit as well in the conversation. You've got to share a bit. For it to be a conversation, you have to give into the conversation as well, whereas an interview implies that you're almost just extracting material from someone. And I think actually it's interesting. So just having the conversation with Matt this morning, I do try to keep myself a little bit out of the way, just because it's an activation call for the client to generate the first 5 episodes of podcast material. I'm not always sure in the first instance whether my voice is going to appear on those episodes or not. So because of that, I probably put a little bit less of myself into it. And unless I feel like the conversation's stalling, which it didn't this morning, but if it feels like it's stalling, I'll be like, okay, I need to give a bit more here. But compared to, say, Not a Straight Line conversation where it is back and forth, if there's loads of back and forth in the podcast activation thing, it doesn't. And then we're trying to create a monologue type episode out of it. It just creates headaches. So there's maybe a bit of consideration.
Yeah, I think that's possibly the exception that proves the rule. If you've got a podcast, you're thinking of a podcast where you want to have conversations with guests. I think the other thing as well is that if you do have a conversation-based podcast and you come at it from a perspective of interviewing your guests, then you really can only have one outcome, and that is positioning your guest as the expert or an expert. Whereas if you have a conversation, you have more of an opportunity to bring your own expertise and your own insights. Like you said, Rob, you're bringing yourself to the conversation. Therefore, the listener has an opportunity to see how you think and how you respond to ideas and thoughts that come up, as opposed to you just asking questions and getting answers from somebody else.
I hate podcasts that just ask the same six questions to 1,000 guests. I'm like, man, can we not have some different questions? Can we not have some questions that actually emerge from the answers that somebody has already given to you?
Yeah, that's when the advice active listening starts to get thrown around a little bit. And I've actually found myself playing with some of my podcast editing clients' structures to try and help that emerge a little bit more. One of our previous Activate Your Podcast clients, Everlake, we've kind of created a on-off kind of situation for their twice a month episode release, where they talk to a guest for one episode, and then Mark and John, the main hosts with each other that do these interviews, they just have a chat amongst themselves about things they do in their business and share advice and, practical things, and just they bounce off each other incredibly well. And so it kind of bridges that gap for them structurally. And if you can't think of doing it conversationally that way, then thinking about doing it for a business perspective and making sure that you get seen, at least until you get the practice in to become conversational.
I think that active listening bit you spoke to there, Matt, is just so important.
It's easy to talk about and it's hard to do.
100%. I mean, our good friend Nick, who's we're currently in the process of launching the Hostery podcast, his new podcast. I shared with him when he had a conversation with me for the Hostery. I was reflecting on the first podcast that I ever hosted and produced, called The Partner's Partner, back in Infusionsoft days. Rob, you remember? I was obviously far less experienced than I am now, and I remember one conversation. Most of the conversations, interviews, were running about an hour and a half, hour and 20 minutes, hour and a half. I got half an hour into this interview, because that's how I was positioning it then, and I was done. I couldn't think of any more questions. And on reflection now, the more experienced version of Pete, I've been doing this for 10 years, you weren't actively listening. You weren't really present and engaged. What are your tips, Rob? Yeah, Rob, what are your tips for active listening?
I basically sit there listening, but I've always got a couple of reserved questions in the back of my mind of where I might go with the conversation next if we kind of run aground. So I've always got an avenue lined up, just so we don't get this kind of awkward pause in conversation. But I'm also completely happy for the conversation to wind its own way, unless I feel it's kind of stalling. And then sometimes you get a sense of okay, we've kind of covered this ground. I'm not really feeling this part so much. So then it's time to move on. So it's kind of knowing when to kind of move the conversation on and kind of when to just let it sit for a while as well.
And is that an experience thing when we go back to being consistent and doing the reps? And
I think you probably have to put your hours in doing it.
There are some people who have the talent, like Pete, you just talked about, that you have actually practiced it. But I think there's a bit of natural talent with you there, as well as with Rob. You kind of approach it in different ways, but that innate ability sits in there. But I think even if you rock in and you're like, okay, I'm the best interviewer in the world, let's go, or the best conversationalist, however you want to frame it, you still should put the practice in. You should still do the reps, because there are going to be things that happen that you can only prepare for with experience. Practice always helps.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the other thing that goes alongside active listening is curiosity. If you have curiosity alongside a desire to be fully present and engaged and active in the conversation, you can't go wrong, really, because curiosity just covers everything. And if somebody says something and you don't really understand what they said, be curious about it. So when you said that, what did you actually mean? Or somebody, if they seem to have skirted over something, like, that sometimes happens in my not a straight line conversations, they'll kind of just say, so then I went to university, and when I left university, I did this. I was like, okay, hang on a second. I'm a little bit curious about what happened in that gap. And it was one of the very first conversations I had. Avon, lovely human, Avon, was previously in the American Army, the intelligence corps, and he almost started the conversation of, when I left the army. It was like that was where he was going to start the conversation. So at least I had a placeholder in the conversation to come back to. But just be curious. Just don't always take things at face value. Be curious and sort of dig into. Don't be afraid to ask questions to uncover what you don't know yet because you haven't been told.
So that's another great technique, I think, as we just quietly run a masterclass on interviews here. The art of interruption, I think. The interrupting of a conversation to expand, to give them the opportunity to create space where they didn't think it was needed, but you want to find out more. I think doing things virtually, there's always a lag component and it's difficult to talk over each other. But I think interrupting appropriately and respectfully is something that quite literally only comes with practice. I was imagining that conversation you mentioned there, Pete, with Avon. There were a couple of times where he just needed to be prodded quite hard to explain the thing that we know is important that we haven't heard yet. And then I left the army, and then I owned a coffee shop, and then I started a business in tech, and you're like, whoa, hang on. Coffee shop? Oh yeah, in Darwin. Oh, so hang on, you moved to Darwin? There was so much in there that he just kind of was skipping past, probably because he's not thought it had value, but in that conversation in Not a Straight Line, it had the value. You were exploring that. But it didn't hamper the conversation. He didn't feel or sound like he was put out by you jumping in and asking more questions. I think that kind of practice takes a bit of skill and practice as well.
So Matt, you're like the Socrates of podcasting. So what is it really annoying to ask someone a question and then reflect the question back to you, or is that something that we should be doing more of as a good interviewer?
How do you mean?
So for a bit of context for you, Pete, as a bit of a teaser for what the activated episodes will hopefully include for what we recorded this morning, I talked about Socratic questioning a little bit as...
Matt's going to sit there with the hemlock and we have to convince him not to drink the hemlock.
That's it.
The podcasting is worth doing and that he shouldn't drink it.
Yes.
And he's going to turn our arguments back around on us.
So full context for the listener there, that the text Gorgias by Plato involved Socrates being forced to drink hemlock, and he was going to be put to death. But his friends gathered around him and said, no, don't drink the hemlock. You need to live. The rest of the world needs what you do. And he's like, but I've done the wrong thing. I got to drink the hemlock. But you know what? You got a couple of hours. If you can convince me not to do it, I won't do it. And in that text, they discuss to convince him, and he bends arguments around back on them, and eventually has them convinced to make the argument he made an hour ago while he reflects their argument back at them and just kind of twists and turns it around a little bit. And for the context of podcasting, this is important because it allows you to kind of reprocess and deliver back whatever you get from a guest to try and unlock the conversation a little bit. It's more of an advanced technique, but you have to be careful with it too, because in the context of that conversation me and Rob had, there was an example where I was trying to help a teacher with technology, and I used the Socratic questioning to where they came to me with a problem. They asked, how do I fix this? And I asked them, how do you think you should fix it? And then they clicked a couple of things and moved some windows around and said, oh, is that it? And I was like, yeah, you did it. So sometimes it's a real benefit to reflect things back at them and challenge, to try and draw a little bit more out where they haven't been challenged before. But you have to be careful sometimes. some conversations, you can't challenge someone for how they recovered or dealt with a trauma in the time that they were either being abused or, lost someone special to them. You can't interrogate that the same way you'd interrogate how someone enjoyed playing a video game. So there's degrees that you can Socratically question someone in a podcast interview. And that's why you need the practice, the context, the environment, the guest. It's all a bunch of parameters that you kind of balance within yourself on the fly and create the questions you need to.
Yeah, that different variety of guests is an interesting thing as well. I've found, I've had over 60 conversations now for Not a Straight Line. And it is interesting that there are some, well, on reflection, even though my desire and propensity is to go deep in the conversation, is they really do just stay up on the surface. And after a while in the conversation, I recognize that that's where the conversation is going to go. And any kind of attempt to go deeper is not going to it's not going to be comfortable for the guest, and it's not going to be a good conversation.
Sometimes you have to share more of yourself. That's a place where if I'm working with a client, say in that situation, and we're kind of skimming along the surface, and I kind of sense that there's more further down, but I don't know how to get there. It's like that's where it needs to be more of a conversation, and I'll start to share more about so the question that I'm about to answer them, I'll give an example of like, well, this, if I'm asking them about what their early childhood memories are, I'll be like, well, these are some of my early childhood memories. Like I remember, I always start off by saying, I remember going on trains with my grandparents and spending time with my grandparents when I was small and things like that. And just giving that bit of examples kind of jogs their thought process a bit and opens up a gateway to some of the stuff that's a bit further down.
And I guess if people are not used to sharing at that level, it's not that they don't want to, they're just not used to it. I've learned something from this episode, even if the listener hasn't.
I think some people just end up on a lot of podcasts and get used to like rattling off the same stories. And I think that's where the kind of questioning technique becomes really useful, because I think you do need to lean on them a bit then and challenge them a bit. You shouldn't feel afraid to challenge a guest, even if they're a big name or whatever.
In fact, they might welcome it. I think people get tired of being asked the same questions.
There are times where it can create like a hard stop, though. Like I recently edited an episode, or almost edited an episode, where the host kind of followed the thread of where the conversation was going. It was a bit hard to pull something out of the guest that was aligning to the subject matter, and she asked a question that had unfortunately been indicated pre-recording that it shouldn't be asked. And the guest just did a hard stop and said, no, I'm not talking about that. And, the host had to kind of, okay, yep, sure. It just sounded like that's where the conversation was going. I'm sorry. I'll have to, and had to kind of recover from that.
That's why I've always got a backup topic up my sleeve.
Yeah, that's
just for those situations, because it will happen.
Yeah. But it's just my point there is to not get discouraged by not only challenging someone who hasn't been challenged before and isn't ready for it, but also getting that hard barrier of trying to explore in a place where the guest doesn't want to go, to not feel discouraged when you hit that, because it'll happen.
I had that quite early in a storytelling project. I was working with a client and I spoke to his business partner about his story, and he got on the call and he was like, you know what, I don't see the relevance in this to our message. I don't really know why you're asking me about my personal story. I don't feel comfortable about this. I just had to go, that's okay. That's fine. We'll just talk about. So we ended up skimming along the surface, but that was okay, because that was where he was at that moment.
Inside you're going, you're wrong.
And it was an important lesson to me to kind of come into the conversation having better prepared the guest and better framed the conversation as to where we were going with it as well. So I think there's maybe a preparation angle that comes in, and I think you're very good at this, Pete, with the not straight line conversations. And going through that yesterday, I received like 3 text messages in the run up and at least 2 emails, and it felt like quite a caring prep and well thought through preparation for at least where the conversation was going to launch from.
And it's a practiced vulnerable space too. There's, I think at the time of recording, 28 episodes out there of Pete practicing with edited content that people can look at as a reference, which you are sharing as part of that induction into the conversation as well. Like all of that plays a part. And I think Not a Straight Line should get its own episode on Help Before You Sell, because it is a very unique space. There's only one other example that I can think of that's very similar, that in a conversation I had recently, but you kind of set the rules of the space, and that allows you to very easily create the conversations you want from it because it is that space. It's like you've come in, it's vulnerable. We're going to be talking about things that will explore your Not a Straight Line journey. And then when you get to the point where you ask, what was your relationship like with your parents? They're not as surprised about it because they're in the right place. They know where they are and they were prepared for it.
I guess that speaks to intention as well. There's a tremendous amount of intention and intentional activity that goes in. As Rob, you talked about the emails and the texts, and at the beginning of the conversation as well, with the breathing exercise I do with the guests, there is tremendous amount of intention about the conversation that's going to be had. So that's another takeaway from this episode, is be intentional about the conversations that you're going to have with your guests. Although on the face of it, I don't prepare, I don't research my guests. It's a different interview format than others. I deliberately don't. Sam Bennett, the number one episode, literally the first episode that came out of Not a Straight Line, her testimonial was being in conversation with Pete is like being in the best possible dinner party conversation you can imagine. And I was like, that's it. That's what I want this conversation to be like. Like that we just sat together at a dinner party. We don't know each other. And when you don't know each other, you can only be curious and present and just ask questions that, take your curiosity. It really can't come back to anything more than that.
I think it's about generous questions as well. So, Rob, for instance, rather than asking, what was your relationship like with your parents? You might ask, did you have a particularly special relationship with any one of your parents? And why might that have been? And then you're forced to pick one parent and explain why. But it allows a bit more nuance, and it's it's the same question. It's just phrased in I think, a more generous way.
You're more likely to get an answer from a question like that, I think. Put some barriers in place, some guiding little queries, and like people in podcasting wonder when they ask for any questions or comments, send them to etc. And they wonder why nothing comes back. But those kinds of questions are really handy.
We've talked about a lot of things to do with interviewing or having conversations with guests on the podcast. Are there any kind of, Rob, you're going to go, fuck, Pete's doing his end of episode.
Pete's doing his right. We talked around the topic. What are the top 5 takeaways for the listener? I'm like, well, go back and listen to the episode because we covered them all in very clear detail.
Maybe this is an episode that has just been free ranging, and take from it what you need.
There's lots of points where the listener, I think, will have gone, tip number 3. Okay, write that down. Yeah, I think it's been good.
My final thought on it was like something we discussed earlier, Matt, was that the value in, say, a podcast specifically is more in the interview than it is inside the editing. And actually, a great interview technique maybe even minimizes the need for editing.
That's right.
So basically, you got to come over to the dark side. Basically, Matt's going to come over to my side. And AI is going to... No, I don't know if AI is going to replace Matt.
What do you actually mean by that, Rob?
Maybe I'll try to condense what we talked about, Rob, because the question that you'd asked me at the time was, I think, do you value... Do you... God, I've forgotten now, actually.
Yeah, so the question was... So the context was that Matt's podcast is shifting from monologue episodes of Matt doing short 5-minute monologue type episodes to interviewing a guest and doing longer form. My question was, ignoring what you do today in your and our business, do you identify more as an interviewer or an editor? Which I think is quite a generous question, but there we go.
It's an excellent question, because it pushed me to ask myself, or the first place that I went to was, do I prefer to interview people for podcast episodes, or do I prefer to be a passive listener and like create the conversation that the audience listens to? And both of those can work to their benefit in equal part, but the interview, working the interview well for a podcast can minimize the effort on the editing side, not just from the logistical and admin, like prepare your space, no dogs barking, baby in the other room, no echo, better microphone, right position, the right microphone, all the electrics working, all that stuff, but also the preparation of questions, the guiding of conversation, the chronology and flow of the conversation, the preparation you do or the lack thereof, but the space you create, the success milestones, the guiding pillars of the show.
Intention you set.
Yeah, that's all before it gets into the microphone. So not just the actual audio, but the interview before it gets into the microphone is an important part as well.
Mm-hmm. So take from this episode what you will, and let us know what you took and bring it back.
Yeah, and we've covered a lot, but just get going. I think get going, but then reflect back. I think for all of us doing interview style podcasts, when you look back to the early ones that you did, there's always a progression, and that's because you, as the first listener, have also developed in the process, both in terms of examining your thoughts and developing your skill, and listening actively, and all of the things that we've talked about. So, as with every help before you start topic, view it as a long-term thing.
Be consistent, reflect. Yeah,
all
the things.
And look out for Coffee with a Podcaster activations, as this is supplemental, coming soon.
Indeed.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of Help Before You Sell, sponsored by Activate Your Podcast. To activate your podcast and help the people who most need you and your services, head to activateyourpodcast.com/help. If you found this episode helpful, please also leave us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. And remember, help more to sell more. See you next time.